Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Hey. Good. How are you doing? There
Hi,
she is.
Beth.
Hello.
How are you doing, Betu?
Good.
Good, good. All right. Thanks for joining us, you two. And thanks to everyone watching. Today we have a slightly different webinar. It's more of a panel discussion with Beth of the Maldivian Manta Ray Project. Yep, there she is. And Betty of the Mobula Project, Indonesia. So what we're going to do is first, the girls are going to introduce you to their work. And then we're going to have a bit of a chat about all the different ways that the girls research mobulids, the pressures that the different mantas and devil rays face in these countries, how they differ, how they compare, some similarities, and the time that Beth spent working with Betty in Indonesia. And I think they had some fun times and maybe some sad times as well. Yeah, so this webinar is going to last about 1 hour. As viewers, you are automatically muted and your video is switched off, but we really want to hear from you. So we have a couple of ways to do this. One of them is through answering our polls. So we're going to be launching polls just like the intro one that you might have just seen throughout the webinar, where we're going to be asking you about your experiences with marine life and with research. And we're going to be sharing some of those results and talking about them as well. And another way is through asking us questions. So we would love to have your questions throughout the chat. We'll try and interweave these into Beth and Betty's chat and ask them your questions as they talk. And if we don't get to any questions through the chat, we'll try to get through as many as we can at the end of their discussion. All right, I think that's it from me. Beth and Betty, if you want to just, how do I change this? There we go. If you want to just introduce yourselves.
Yeah, I'll start. So my name's Beth, and I'm lucky enough to be based out in the Maldives, working for the Maldivian Manta Ray Project, which is the founding project of the Manta Trust. I first moved to the Maldives in 2015. So at first I was working as a general marine biologist, taking guests out in the water, doing some turtle rehabilitation, also some coral restoration. If we switch to the next slide, you'll see some pictures of me doing this. So I love my time, especially with the turtles. They were great fun to work with, and getting to release them at the end of their rehabilitation was really, really rewarding. And then after this, during this time, I got to know Manta Trust. My first resort, we had a volunteer from Manta Trust based there. So I got to learn about the work that Manta Trust did in a bit more detail. And then in 2017, I was lucky enough to be offered a job with Manta Trust in the south of the Maldives, in an atoll called Laamu. So I was the project manager down here. Myself and my assistant Haisham, we used to go diving every day, taking ID shots of the mantas, learning about their behaviours. Here it was mostly cleaning mantas, and got to know the very small population that live in Laamu, so it's only about 150 individuals, and really got to know all of the mantas down there. After this, I then moved to Laamu Atoll, which is where I am now based. So super lucky, get to go to Haniforo Bay, see all of the mass feeding. There's been a couple of webinars already about the Maldivian Manta Ray Project, so I'm sure you've heard all about Haniforo Bay. But yeah, I feel really, really lucky to be based up here now, working alongside Flossie and Caitlin, who some of you may have met in an earlier webinar. But between my time in Laamu and Laamu Atoll, I was lucky enough to go and visit Betty in Indonesia. So I went to visit her project, which is the Mobula Project Indonesia, based in Eastern Java, a little fishing town called Munsha. And it was a very, very different experience to what I'm used to in the Maldives, but was really, really eye-opening. I learned a lot from Betty and learned a lot from going to see the project. But first, I'll let Betty introduce herself, and then we will talk about some of the experiences we had whilst we were together and what we do at our different bases. Off to you, Betty.
Thanks, Beth. So I'm Betty, as you know, and I'm basically at the moment in the Azores, where I'm conducting a PhD. But I started the Mobula Project in Indonesia in 2015. And what motivated me to start this project was visiting some fisheries of manta and mobula rays in Peru through a project of the Manta Trust. And initially I was thinking of working with manta rays, but I noticed that there were tons and tons of mobula rays that were being landed in the fish markets, much more than the manta rays in that location. And I started to ask myself, like, if anybody was working on these animals, and there were already a couple of researchers that had been doing it, including Daniel Fernando in Sri Lanka, but very few in some locations of the world. And so I contacted some different people to try and gain some more insight into this, including some people from the University of Queensland who've been supporting me since the beginning. Professor Michael Bennett is one of them. And basically found that there was like a great need to do this also specifically like in Southeast Asia, and Indonesia was one of the locations where these animals were being landed in large quantities. And I didn't start this project alone, so I basically had the pleasure to work with 3 people at the beginning: Bidlia, Dita, and Gerald, who you can see here in the middle photo. And we started by visiting different locations in Indonesia, but we very rapidly based ourselves in Muncar, because it was a location where the most mobula rays were being landed, including like other species like sharks and many other individuals. And also because we had a greater opportunity to work with the community there. They were very open to us coming there and collaborating with them, because of course all this work, when we work with the fisheries, animals that are caught by fisheries, we also work with the fishermen and the communities. So it's not just researchers going there and staying by themselves. And these are a lot of people also who have been part of the project, who are currently in the project, who we work with. So we work with different types of stakeholders, from the government, from the Indonesian Institute of Sciences, but also other NGOs. And of course, we have in the team like a lot of Indonesian young scientists who are really like a driving force of the project. And Beth, when Beth visited, you had the chance to meet Didik, who was working with us at that time. So yeah, and basically we started this project to try and understand what was the state of the mobula fisheries in Indonesia. What were the potential alternatives that we could find to curb the fisheries, and how this would like impact the local communities. So after starting this project, I decided to also undertake a PhD. And so for this, I'm based at the University of the Azores, where I am at the moment, and I collaborate with the University of Queensland. And during my PhD, I'm basically analyzing some data that we collect through the Mobula Project in Indonesia, but I'm not only looking at data from Indonesia, I look at the sensory biology of mobulid rays and their feeding ecology, and I'm trying to understand like how they basically perceive the world. And this is interesting in itself, but also because they are animals, like you maybe know, that have like a huge cognitive abilities. They're social animals. With at least manta rays are social animals, we now know, and they have like a pretty large brains amongst sharks and rays. But also because studying this could potentially like provide insight into how we can try to reduce their bycatch. So we'll talk more about that in a second. If you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so basically what was interesting, I think, in meeting Beth and having her over in Indonesia, in Muncar, is that you got to see the other side of the coin, let's say, of working with these animals, and that they're still being landed, although manta rays are protected. And I think Sarah gave a nice webinar on this topic. Occasionally they're still landed. Mobula rays are still landed because it's still authorized in Indonesia, but even manta rays can sometimes be caught in nets because they constitute bycatch that's caught like in gill nets that are non-selective, that are usually targeting tuna and marlin and swordfish. And so this is a big topic that we have to address. And to do this, one of the things that we're looking at is trying to assess the mortality of mobulid rays. If we try to release them from gill nets once they've been caught, do they have a capacity to survive? We want to know this because if we want to start thinking about management measures, asking fishermen to sometimes release the animals if they're alive, we want to know if they're going to survive, because if they can't survive after being released, then it would be a waste to release them, and we have to think about other measures. And so to do that, we started deploying survival tags, so satellite tags on animals that are caught by the fishermen, and then we asked the fishermen to release the ray in the water, and this tag will give us information on how long the animal has survived and what it has been doing, where it has been going. And that involves spending nights on fishing boats, and Beth had the pleasure to come with us to do that. You want to chat about that, Beth?
Yeah, I was so excited. I remember I think it was the very first day I got to Muncha, and you had said to me, okay, tonight we're going to go and stay on a fishing boat. And I was like, oh, this is so exciting. We thought maybe they might catch a mobula and we'd get to tag it and release it. So went down to the fish market in the harbour where we got onto the boat and we set off, and spirits were high, but when the sun went down and we then tried to get some sleep, that wasn't quite the same. I remember me, you and Stephanie from the project in Peru, we were all huddled at the front of the boat. The fishermen had sort of made us this sleeping quarters by hanging up a piece of tarpaulin, and we were all snuggled together because we were freezing cold. And we got quite damp from being on the boat overnight. So the next time we were going to do it, we brought these really wonderful plastic overalls thinking they were going to keep us dry. But instead, they just made us really, really, really damp underneath. And yeah, I remember the first time I was really excited. The second time I was like, oh, and then the third time I was like, oh.
Go back to the Maldives. I want to go back to the Maldives. So yeah, we did have some good times though on the boat, and this is something that that we're continuing. I mean, we've been on pause now with the virus situation, but that we're planning to continue like as soon as we're going back to the field with the team, the Indonesian team that's currently in Indonesia. But yeah, you got a really good insight into that. We didn't manage to tag a mobula while you were there, but you still got to see like the process, let's say, of how it works. And unfortunately, you also witnessed a couple of shark catches, right? When we went out on the boat, the fishermen sometimes catch some sharks that are like in the Bali Strait, also in the gill nets, especially thresher sharks, juvenile thresher sharks. That appear to be like hanging around in those like waters that are more coastal. Yeah. So yeah, but what is really interesting and important to know is that while it may not seem glamorous when you look at these photos, like to work at fish markets, it's actually a very, very important, like it's a crucial way that we can get important information on these animals. Since we have access to dead animals that we're obviously not catching for scientific purposes, they're retained bycatch by the fishermen, we can have access to like looking at things like their reproduction, looking at things like collecting samples. So we collect morphometric data, so basically measuring the different animals. We're trying to understand their growth rates, so collecting vertebrae to look at age and growth, to try and understand the rates of growth and how that can help us estimate potential extinction rates, or like the risk of extinction, let's say. And we look also at things like demography. We've been collecting samples for genomic projects, stable isotope that we use to look at feeding ecology. And yes, so we're basically using a range of different methods. And if you can switch to the next slide, Lossie. So some other things that we do is, so we also unfortunately sometimes record landings of pregnant mobulas. And as you can see on the top left photo, this is an embryo that was landed inside one of the pregnant females. And so we try to collect data on these also. And it can give us important information. We're trying to understand if there are like specific reproductive seasons during the year that could potentially give us indications as to when we would want to limit the fisheries, or try to understand at which locations the mobulas are being landed on a very fine scale, so that we can try to understand if there's any possibility to have some kind of temporal or spatial management and like regulations on the fishery. We also collect information, and Beth got to come with us. We sometimes try to understand like also the market for meat, so the processed mobula, once they catch it, like what are they doing with it? And one of the main uses is to sell the dried meat, and you can see a sample of that on the lower right picture. And this one is sold directly in Muncha at the same location where the mobulas are being landed. But some of the meat is then also being brought to other places. So we're trying to understand all of this. Basically, it could give us very important information as to what the demand is and how to regulate it.
And Betty, we've had a question. What is that meat used for? Is it eaten, or is it used for medicine, or?
So it's eaten, but it's not. It doesn't appear to be like a very highly praised type of meat. But it's mainly used in the region for satay. So it's like these skewer, like fish that they grill. And it's sold at like some of the local markets, either in the dry form or already processed in like satay skewers. But it's not, like, as I said, as highly sought after or as expensive as something like a marlin tuna or swordfish. So it's retained because it still has a value, but it's not like the main target of these fishermen.
And are the gills sent to Asian countries to be used in medicine?
So they used to be. At the moment, from the information that we've gathered, so this trade is now regulated, the international trade, since mobulas were all added to the CITES Appendix 2 in 2016, and Indonesia has been doing like great work to implement this in the country. But it remains extremely challenging, obviously, because there's such a huge country. And so the processing factories that we know of in the region that used to process, for example, manta gill plates and mobula gill plates before they were added to CITES, some of them have closed. So we know that there appears to have been some impact of this CITES regulation on like curbing at least the international trade. But of course, it's highly likely that illegal trade remains. And we're not looking directly into that at the moment.
Okay. We had another question from Max, who was asking if it's high in mercury like shark meat is.
I think it is. I know it's high in heavy metals, and there was a nice study published on this in Mobula, the spine tail, that found like quite high levels of heavy metals. I can't remember if it was specifically mercury or if it was other heavy metals, but they're definitely present in there in high quantities, and I wouldn't want to be eating this. So yeah, it appears that trade, like for the gills, was mainly like a marketing, more of a marketing thing. It's not traditional. It's been around only for like a couple of like around 50 years. So and there's no scientific evidence to show that it helps to cure anything, although it's being marketed as like a cure-all kind of remedy. Yeah.
Okay. So we've heard a little bit about your research techniques, but Beth, maybe you can tell us, we've had our first poll, so thanks everyone for voting. And it appears that people are quite familiar with satellite tagging, photo ID, a bit less familiar with stereo video photogrammetry, maybe biopsy and underwater ultrasound. Maybe Beth, you can tell us a bit about what kind of methods you use in the Maldives and what your experience was doing different methods with Betty.
Yeah, so in the Maldives, we're super lucky that all of our research takes place underwater with the mantas. So most of you have said you're not too familiar with the stereo video photometry. It's a mouthful to say. But yeah, so this is basically what we use in the water to measure the mantas. So you can see in the photograph on the top left, this is actually Flossie in the water with the manta ray. So it's two GoPros that are welded in a specific direction, and it's calibrated to a software. So what we do is we go down and we take the photograph of the belly of the manta so that we have its ID. Then we will give the signal to the person that has the SVP. They will swim behind the manta, and they have to start both of the GoPros, and we will do a signal so that we know the exact same point on both of the videos. So whether it's someone hitting their fins together or someone hitting their hands together like this, but it's so we can perfectly line up the two videos. These are then put into a software, and it allows us to get a measurement of the manta. So this is what we use that for. We then have our underwater ultrasound. So this is quite a new piece of technology. I actually got to start playing with this when I was in Laamu, so in the south of the Maldives. And basically what this allows us to do is it allows us to perform an ultrasound on the manta without having to touch the manta. So previously there has been ultrasounds done before, but never contactless. So this is the first contactless ultrasound that will be done on manta rays in the wild. So we just swim down and hover above the manta. Before we do so, we make sure we watch the manta rays' behavior. So we check that they're okay with us being in the water, that they're not too skittish around humans, and then we can go and we can take the scan. It's linked to a phone, so we can actually see what we're scanning as we do it. And we've been lucky enough to scan pups before, so I'm not sure if any of you guys on here listened to Neve's webinar where he talked about his PhD, but this research, the SVP and the ultrasound is going towards that. And then biopsies. So biopsies are where we take a sample, either of skin or muscle, and then we can analyze this for different things like genetics. So it's how we can distinguish different populations. But yeah, so we do all of these in the Maldives. Betty, you also do biopsies where you take samples of muscle.
Yeah, exactly. So that's, for us, is much easier, of course, like working in the market. So we just have challenges with like the freshness of the individuals, depending on the samples that we're collecting. They can be like hanging around. Usually we want to get them as soon as they're coming off the fishing boats. And if it's a short fishing trip overnight, then there's no big issue. But sometimes some boats can go a little bit further, like for longer durations, and then we can get like some mobulas that have been stored without freezers on boats in hot Indonesian sun.
You can tell when they've
it
been
smells.
The smell from the fish market. I don't think I smelled normal the whole time I was in Muncha. I smelled disgusting, and you just have to get used to it. But yeah, you can tell.
I don't smell it anymore. I'm already immune to it. But yeah, so it's an advantage indeed. So we can collect fishermen allowing, because again, like this is only thanks to the fishermen and the processors. So the people who are the first ones to receive the mobulas from the fishermen and to process them before they sell them to the first like buyers, let's say. And they have been extremely welcoming to us, and at least like they let us kind of like go there in the middle of their work and bother them a little bit with like trying to get pieces of different things. And of course, that's our main limitation on collecting samples. Like we don't want to push it too far. We don't want to slow them down in their work. Obviously, they're doing their work. They're just processing fish, and sometimes that happens to be a mobula. And so we have to contend with that, and basically, like be very happy when they let us like collect a sample. So usually it's muscle. We collected a lot of vertebrae when possible. And then things like, although we've been looking at feeding ecology, usually we'd want to look also at stomach contents. It's one of the most direct methods of looking at what a mobulid has eaten. But sometimes that's been difficult to collect because I was quite surprised when I first arrived there to find that I was kind of like fighting with some old ladies in the market to get those stomachs, because they wanted to use the contents, which are usually krill or like small bait fish, to use as like, there's some kind of fermented dish that's eaten locally, so they sometimes use that if like the stomach content is still really fresh. I was quite surprised to find that out. And if not, it can also be used by fishermen like as like a kind of chum or like a bait for other, like while they're fishing. So yeah, we don't always have like equal access to like whatever we think we want to collect. We have to be flexible with that.
You saying about the fishermen and working around them, that's something that I found really interesting. How you had obviously formed this relationship with the fishermen by being there, and they were actually quite welcoming in their own way. They would hand us stuff, the vertebrae and the tails of the mobulas that they knew we wanted without even us having to ask.
Yeah, definitely. I guess when we first arrived there, they were a little bit surprised, especially as I was collecting eyes. So there was a little bit of like, oh, what are these people doing with these, collecting these eyes and all these different samples? But now they are very used to it, and they will just, as you say, like even keep it for us sometimes if they happen to encounter a mobula that's been landed while we're not at the fishing market. So they're extremely friendly. And again, like, I don't know if all the people listening are aware of this or not, because I know that like it can be quite like emotionally challenging for some people, like to witness like mobulid rays or Manta Mobula rays being landed and witnessing that they're still being killed and everything, especially for people who used to interact with them when they're alive. But it's important to know that these people in these communities are extremely kind, normal people, very friendly, and they basically are doing this as if they were, you know, processing like as I said, like a tuna or a sardine. Like it's just for them, who most of them have never had the opportunity, well, all of them, none of them I think have had the opportunity to interact with a live animal. Not all of these fishermen knows how to swim. It's a completely alien concept to even look at these as if like, as we look at them like dolphins or whales or these animals that have something special compared to other species. And of course they do have something special because they have very conservative life histories that are very different from most of the teleos fish. And that's something that we try to little by little, like to you know, pass this message in the education outreach that we're doing, but keeping in mind that our sometimes preconceived ideas of what the solutions are to curb this fishery don't work in all locations in the same way. So you, for example, Beth, in the Maldives, like you said, how ecotourism there is like such a great, it's helping basically conservation, right? And it brings income to the local community.
Yes. You in Indonesia, obviously you face fishing as a huge problem. In the Maldives, we're really lucky that we don't have this pressure on our mobulas. So it's illegal to fish any rays or any sharks within the Maldives. But like you were saying, we do face other pressures, such as tourism, unregulated tourism. So you can see in the top right picture, this is one of our Laamu Atoll mantas, Baba Ganoush, who was hit by a boat. And here it's really important that we work with the government to implement marine protected areas, but not only just to implement these, but to make sure that we help encourage the government to regulate movement of tourists and boats within these areas as well, so that we don't get issues like you can see with Baba here. Then we also face other issues, climate related issues. So if things carry on the way they're going, maybe there won't be food in areas where the mantas often get it. And here in the Maldives, one thing we're seeing is habitat degradation. So we get a lot of coral bleaching here. That you can see in the bottom picture, where the corals, they turn white. I won't go into detail about this. I'm sure lots of you have heard about it before. But basically a lot of the reefs in the Maldives have been struggling, which means that they're not as healthy as they once were. So in Laamu Atoll, we have a few cleaning stations that used to be really active, where the mantas would come to clean. But because of the effects of the habitat degradation, they're not as active as they once were. So yeah, we face lots of these. I'm sure you can talk about how you tackle the fishing pressures, but here with the tourism, we have developed a code of conduct that we try and encourage tourist operators to follow and get their guests to follow, which we are showing here. So this was developed by Manta Trust. Whenever we take guests out in the water, we try to encourage them to follow this, and we also follow it ourselves as well. This helps the manta rays feel relaxed around us. If you go and you chase a manta or you touch a manta, it's going to swim away. If it keeps happening again and again, then they might not come back, which is why we use this code of conduct, not only to help them feel more relaxed, but also to give us the best interaction we can have. Also, when it comes to diving, we want to encourage people to not sit on the reef, not hold on to live coral, not damage the reef, as this will contribute to the degradation of the habitat. Yeah.
You can see in the poll now that it's nice to see that 57% of people were asked to follow interaction guidelines if they saw megafauna like manta rays or whale sharks. So maybe some of these were even the Manta Trust Code of Conduct. Yeah. But obviously, Beth, in the Maldives, we have tourism as a way to provide a reason not to fish these animals. But Betty, that's slightly different in Indonesia. Do you have any options for tourism with mobulid rays?
So in Indonesia as a whole, like there's a huge income coming in from interactions with manta rays, and there's a few famous sites for that. I think Sarah probably mentioned that in her webinar, but that's one of the incentives that helped the government to actually push forth like a national protection for manta rays on a national scale. So it was really, really positive for them to see through a nice study that came out by Mary O'Malley, I think, showing like a global assessment of like how live manta rays were worth much more than dead ones. For devil rays, Mobula rays, it's a little bit more tricky because while there are some places where you can have like interactions with them on a regular basis, like the Azores, where I am is one of those locations. And in this location, like the dive industry gets a lot of income coming from Mobula ray aggregations. But in Indonesia, there's much few currently. So I know of 2 or 3 locations where there are dives like proposed for tourists to interact with mobulas at like places where they're regularly observed, like some in South Lombok and some in the Maluku Islands, for example. But this is not the solution everywhere, because obviously diving requires having like, you know, sufficiently clear waters to be able to actually observe the animals, and then not a constant like traffic of boat traffic, basically. And then again, like depending on the currents, like the safety of the location, and then again, like what is the actual you know, development or like capacity for the local community to do this? Because the objective, you know, we don't want to introduce something that is going to benefit, for example, in Munchar, that is going to benefit like some companies coming into Munchar to bring tourists to go diving. We would want that to go to the local community in one way or another. And there are different ways that people are exploring doing that through like some kind of taxes, like that goes back to the local community. But Munchar has not actually adapted for that, because it's one of the, actually, although it's a small fishing village, it's one of the biggest artisanal fisheries in Indonesia. So there are hundreds of boats. There's over 600 gillnet boats operating in Munchar. And while not all of them capture mobulids, it's a huge amount of boats on the water. And each of these boats will have like 1 or 2 or 3 families, like depending on the catches from that boat for their income. And the whole community is based on like the fishery. So not just mobulas. Once again, mobulas is a very small portion of that whole fishery. But since this whole like community is structured around it and around the processing of the fish, the factories that also can some of the different fish, it's not a location where you could come in and say to everybody, well, now we're going to bring people diving, because first of all, there wouldn't be enough jobs to you know, provide for all the people in the community. And it wouldn't be sustainable, because there wouldn't be enough tourists to be able to provide those jobs currently. and also because it's actually not secure. So we went in the water when we first started to try to tag the mobulids. We actually tried to do it in the water. So we went out with the fishing boats and jumped in the water, like free diving and trying to tag the mobulids, but the visibility is around 3 meters to 5 meters in front of you. It's a zone that's extremely, has a very strong seasonal upwelling, so bringing a lot of plankton and things to the surface, but it also has a lot of water pollution because there's no like sewage treatment like in some other locations. So there's huge amounts of pollution going into the water and affecting the visibility, including the nutrient from the upwelling. And it just makes the condition unsecure, like for people to dive, and it doesn't give the ability to actually see the animals. So I'm really I support like ecotourism, and I love doing it myself in the locations where it's possible to do it. And despite that was one of the potential alternatives that I had in mind when starting the project, just before knowing this community and the specificities of the location, I had to admit that that was probably not going to be one of the solutions in this specific location, and the other management measures were needed that have to do with the fisheries. So looking at more sustainable fisheries and the bycatch management, how to release the animals. And of course, there are some ways also to tackle this, which would be like to look at the actual fishing methods that are being used, because gill nets is a hugely non-selective fishery that causes a lot of bycatch in general. But then again, when we're talking about more than 600 boats, like it would require, of course, like either governmental or external financial help if we wanted to tell people, okay, now you cannot use the gill nets anymore. We're going to use pole and line, for example, which is a much more sustainable way of fishing. All of this requires investment, and in our capacity of our project, like we're now touching something that's much bigger than just looking at mobula conservation. It's like looking at this as a more like ecosystem perspective, and like looking at things like, can we manage the fisheries then with keeping the fisheries, but managing them in a temporal and spatial scale, looking at like on the fine scale, where are the locations where these mobulas are being fished? Can we, potentially like limit the fishing in those areas and not in other locations? So it's a huge puzzle that we're still working on with the communities, with the help of scientists from the government, and it's an ongoing process.
It's very different issues that you've got there to what we have here. Very different approaches need to be taken. I remember, well, here we're lucky we've got just crystal clear waters, so we can obviously do the ecotourism thing. But when we went for a snorkel, when I came to visit you, and I remember the reef was probably only 1 meter below me, and you could just make out all the little fish when we were in those shallow waters. And not even just that, I remember we all jumped in and then we tried to get the fisherman that had taken us out to try on one of our masks, and he just had no interest at all. He was happy swimming in the water, cooling off, but to have a look at what was down there, it was completely alien. He knew fishing and nothing else. And to try and get someone like that, obviously you can train someone and you can educate them, but it's just not what they're used to at all. It would be such a huge change for some of these fishermen that have known that their whole lives. And Munchar especially, it's known for fishing, like you said.
I think that there is, like there would be, there are locations, for example, that you came with me, like in a place called Laglbauer, where there's a few reefs that are left after like some, I think, past potential like dynamic fishing and things like that have affected them greatly. And then the visibility and the pollution, I think that's really affected the corals. But there's still like some nice things to see in some locations that potentially a handful of fishermen could benefit from. Like that is definitely like still a possibility, but it's not directly related to like seeing mobulid rays or seeing sharks in that location. And it's not something that could be an alternative livelihood, at least, in the current state of things for everybody in the community. But then again, like things, and it's something that's highly like in their, it's something that these people love doing, actually, fishing. And so looking at solutions that are like into more sustainable fisheries that don't take away from them like their you know, their act of fishing and going out to sea is something that can potentially like work, because it can appeal, like it can be more feasible, let's say, to get the support of the fishermen to want to do it, because that's an important consideration also, is that if we come up as conservationists with something in a location and just come and say, well, we think that you should stop fishing and doing this now, the whole community, they can tell us to go away and they don't want to hear what we have to say, and that happens.
I remember when I first got out there, I'd never been to a fish market before where sharks, mobulids were landed. This was my first time when I came out to Indonesia to see you, and I remember my view on it. I was like, no, it shouldn't happen. We shouldn't be fishing. This should stop. And when I first got to the fish market, at first the mobulids we were seeing were already cut up, and then I saw my first full one, and it really moved me. I found it really difficult to see that landed. But then seeing the way the fishermen interacted with the sharks and the mobulids that they landed, it was just like another fish to them, like you've said before. And then the more days we spent in the fish market, and we went to the fisherman's house and we met his family and we saw where he lived, and I got to know the environment around the fish market and know their views on why they do it, and it is just a way of life, and it completely changed the way I see fisheries, and like you're saying, taking it away just wouldn't work.
Yeah, I mean, for the fishery itself, I mean, I don't eat fish, for example. That's my personal choice to like not contributing to bycatch, but of course, like for these people, it's like I don't, for example, I think it would be ideal if we could find solutions to you know, have artisanal small-scale fisheries, because I don't necessarily support like commercial fisheries, but having, you know, small-scale fisheries with like direct kind of like small-scale supply chains also, and like trying to reduce as much as we can like the bycatch from that is like a first direction where we're trying to like go towards, basically. And like in my opinion, ideally we would be able to like limit completely the mobulid bycatch. I don't support, of course, like catching, you know, manta and mobula rays, because, well, first of all, because I tend to like them as animals, but scientifically because as we mentioned earlier, they have extremely conservative life histories, and even amongst sharks and rays, and that's the case also for many sharks, including sharks that are being caught in Muncha. And so having you know, some form of regulation on this, of like and there's many different ways that this can be done. The government in Indonesia has already been putting out some management measures to try and regulate some shark catches, like looking at quotas that they can land. In the case of mobula, since this is not a target fishery in the location where we're working, it's really more to do with the bycatch. How can we limit it? And then, as I mentioned earlier, like if they do happen to catch a mobula in the net that wasn't intended to be there, because they don't know what's going to swim in the net, can we release it? And so we hope at least that is going to be like one of the potential ways to go. But then if we release it, we need to understand how long can we leave the net in the water to expect having a manta or mobula that is still going to survive the release. And of course, trying to, again, like not go to fish to the locations where, during the seasons where there's huge amounts of mobulas in the water at specific locations, then of course we would want to try to avoid that. So many different solutions for many different locations and extremely diverse ways to work in conservation across these different regions.
I think something that's important in both regions though is the education. So we've both done education programs here in the Maldives. We have our education program, Muda Madarusa, that was set up by Flossie, and we go into schools and we have a marine education program that we teach them. Part of this, for us, we're really lucky as we can take the kids into the water, teach them to be comfortable in the water for those of them that aren't, introduce them to manta rays and help them to fall in love with the environment that we want them to protect. and teach them the ways how they can protect it. When I was in Indonesia with you, we went to a school as well, and obviously it's very different there. We can't take the kids snorkeling. The closest place that we could take them is probably a couple of hours on a boat, so it's not really feasible with the school, but they were still super engaged to everything you were teaching them, and I remember the teacher saying the next day that all the kids were picking up the plastic in the school, and
yeah, that was really nice. Yeah,
they felt inspired. And then in the fish market as well, we would speak to the fishermen, and they were actually interested in learning about what we were doing. They weren't just asking questions for the sake of it. It seemed like they took on board what we were saying to them. And I remember the first day we got some weird looks. It was me, you and Stephanie in the fish market, and they kind of were staring like, what these three girls doing in the fish market. And then a few of them already knew you, so got speaking to us all, and yeah, it was really interesting.
Yeah, that was kind of like an out of the norm, let's say, field work, like a few days, because usually, so yeah, the team of the Mobula Project is like mostly composed of Indonesian young students, and they a lot of them actually that work with us now have been working on their own like thesis projects in that location before. So some of them have very close relationships with the fishermen and their families, and so, but in general, yeah, they are very welcoming, and it's not common to have foreigners in that location. So we are the only foreigners usually who visit that location, because there's no real touristic activity to do. There's no hotels, potentially like a very few guest houses, but there's no beach where you can swim, for example, in the water, because the water is quite very dirty actually around Muncha. You have to go out with a boat for at least an hour or so to get, or at least half an hour, like to get clearer water. So it doesn't attract a lot of people. But it's an extremely beautiful community for its people, and what you were saying, Beth, yeah, that's very true. Like, so they're very, very open to like to talking with us, and we also like learn a lot from them. Like, they have so much knowledge, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do, is trying to, like, through conversations and like more like interviews with them, is trying to gather their knowledge so that we can understand how they relate to all of this. And then also, yeah, the outreach with the kids is fascinating, especially since most of these children are daughters and sons of fishermen, because fishing is a main activity in the region. So it's fascinating to see them, like, watch videos of mobulids or sharks, like alive, because most of them don't swim. So, they've never seen this before. And yeah, there's extreme also other problems in which are this huge plastic pollution that's affecting the lives of the local people there. And so seeing these kids, as you were saying, Beth, like the next day just picking up every single piece of plastic and like trying to not ask for straws anymore, and this kind of thing is very heartwarming. And it's like, and our role of like basically trying to do conservation with Mobulas, we end up wanting to address so many other things, because it's never an isolated issue, let's say. And we're really happy to be able to do that.
Have you ever used virtual reality with the kids? Because I know Anna in Azores uses it, and then me and Beth have used it in the Maldives, and the reactions are priceless.
Yeah, I'd really like to do that. We haven't done it yet, but yeah, if there's the opportunity to do it at some point, I think it would be ideal. Yeah. Considering that it's extremely difficult to get these kids, like in the water or close to the water at the moment. So yeah, I think that's something on the to-do list, definitely.
Great. Guys, I think we'll go to a few questions, because we've got about 10 minutes left. I could talk for hours about this, or listen to you guys talk for hours about this. But I will ask you a couple of questions. So firstly, you talked a little bit about the fishermen and the fishing communities in Muncha. Is that how you say it?
Muncha.
Muncha. And somebody's asking if the fishermen feel that science has a negative connotation, or if they're worried that their livelihoods might be negatively impacted by science or research?
So in my experience in Munchar, there was, especially at the beginning when I first went there with the Vidlia in 2015, we had a bit of like a fearfulness, let's say, from especially the shark fishermen, much less the mobulid fishers, because I think there hadn't been so many incentives specifically directed at like trying to do science with Mobula rays, like in that region. And so the shark fishermen were a bit more, let's say, scared, because they fish at much broader fishing grounds, and they sometimes sell their catches at locations where there has been like a lot of conservation efforts. For example, Tanjung Luar in Lombok, and so they were a little bit more like kind of, oh, what are you doing here? Like, why, you know, are you gonna stop all like shark fisheries with the data? We like a bit. So I just at first like actually at first when we started, we were only collecting Manta and Mobulid data, not shark data. We started doing that later once we, not because we didn't want to, but there were other people doing it, Indonesian scientists doing it at the time. And when the need was there a couple of years later, when the government had some funding cuts, we then decided to include collecting data for, like, in collaboration with our Indonesian collaborators from the Indonesian Institute of Sciences. And by that time, the fishermen had already like kind of got to know us better and seen that we, you know, we're not just scientists that are going there and like going away and going to put photos on the internet saying that these are horrible people, you know, like intentionally killing all these animals. And so I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think outreach is extremely important, and there's like a place for both ways to do it, and it's important also to show what's happening. But obviously, you know, in some locations we also have to think about how that's going to impact the community and how it's going to impact like the long-term conservation impact that we want to have, because that's the main goal. And I think both are important. Like showing to the people that, like, you know, this is happening is important, because then that can do a kind of like top-down approach of like convincing governments like to put regulations and things in place. But then the bottom-up approach is so important, because if not, there won't be any compliance, and we can have regulations that the fishermen are not going to comply to, and then nothing is really going to change. So yeah, so we were able basically like to navigate that until now. Our first study on the shark catches came out recently, and we haven't been you know, we haven't had any like negative, you know, feedback from the fishermen on that. I think that, yeah, I think we fortunately we have passed that stage of fearfulness. But
okay, great. And we had another one from Julia. Hi, Julia. She said, this is for you, Betty. Since you started working there, have you noticed a decrease in the number of Mobula rays being landed?
So that's a really good question. It's one of our objectives, is to like try to understand if there is a decrease or not. And obviously it's difficult to do that like over, it can seem like a long time. 5 years is a long time of doing the project, but in that time frame, we weren't always constantly at the fish market like we have the capacity to do now. So it's still difficult to draw conclusions. But on the preliminary data that we have, like there appears to be some slight decreasing trends in some species. So namely in Mobula mobular, the spine-tail, which is one of the mobulas that's landed the most in this location. For some species, yeah, it's still very difficult like to draw these conclusions at the moment. So what we're trying to do is also incorporate like interviews with the fishermen and asking them, you know, how do they perceive, sometimes with direct or indirect questions about how many mobulas they used to catch, you know, like 20 years ago, 10 years ago. Were their fishing grounds the same as they are now? Do they have to go further out to sea? Do they, you know, all of this can give us like kind of help us to understand those trends. So yeah, so it's still a vague answer, but there are there are declining trends, we know, and there's a really good study that Sarah put out a couple of years ago, also using like interviews and like more historical data, showing that there's over 90% decreases in landings in some of these species. So it's huge decreases population and when landings, so potentially population decreases also that are concerning. And but in terms of putting this out, you know, with like scientific data, I think we're hopefully close to that.
Great. Yeah, Sarah did a really good webinar on, what day are we on today? She did it on Monday. So it's on the website now for anyone who missed it. She does a lot with Indonesian manta rays. And so, yeah, go and check it out because that was super interesting. She was talking about similar stuff as you, Betty, with working with the fishermen and not demonizing fishermen and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, she's been doing incredible work, and we've learned a lot from Sarah, and she's going to be helping us actually with some of our satellite tagging studies. So her project is like a really great example of like how they've, you know, like managed to include like the local community now in like some of the conservation efforts.
Yeah. Okay, cool. We've had a question about the kind of experience that you had, Beth. So you went from swimming with live manta rays in the Maldives to mantas or mobulas or sharks in the fish markets. Is there anything that you saw that was really unusual or really shocked you?
Yeah, so, well, like I said, I'd never seen it before I went there. And the first few days, everything was already processed, already cut up, and it didn't really have the impact that I assumed it was going to have on me. And then the first time I saw a whole mobula landed, that really got me. It was hard because there you're not allowed, well, you can, but the fishermen don't see it as something emotional. So it's not good to show emotion. So I held in my emotions. I was strong, and I got home and I felt down about it. And then I processed that. And then a couple of days later, we had these two hammerhead sharks landed that were both pregnant, and I think we counted 50 pups between them when they were removed. And again, that was another stab in the heart. And then one day we were sat, and this huge truck pulled up, and it had all these yellow tubs on the back, and they started unloading this meat that had obviously been sat there for a few days. It didn't smell great. And they poured the first bucket out, and the skin was really dark, and we were like, oh my gosh, it's a manta. Like, it was the first manta. We're surprised we're able to witness this. And then we went and we looked a bit closer, and we were like, this doesn't look like a manta. This meat doesn't look like manta meat. And then we noticed part of the jaw, and we said, what could this be? We were thinking about it. And a few days earlier, actually, we had been discussing megamouths whilst we were on one of the fishing boats. And we looked at each other, and we were like, this can't be, surely this isn't a megamouth. And we got a photograph up on our phones, and we were showing all the fishermen that had landed it. Is this what you caught? Is this what you caught? And they were all nodding yes. And yeah, we saw a megamouth landed, it wasn't whole when we saw it, but still crazy to know that that's what it was. We managed to get a sample as well, which is one of very few samples from megamouths that's ever been taken, and we took it back to the university when we went to Jakarta. But yeah, that was crazy. There was a few things that were really sad, but
That's
also
mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Did you see the video of the megamouth, the live one, recently off the coast of Japan?
It's incredible. Yeah,
such an amazing video.
So cool, and it like comes right up to the diver and has a look at the diver as well. And I love it. It's like translated from Japanese on my Facebook. I don't know if it's the same on yours, and it's translated to mega mouse. Did it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got one more question from Max, which I'll just ask you, Betty, quickly because we're running a bit low on time.
Yeah.
He said, with regards to reducing bycatch in gill nets, I know there is some research suggesting sharks can be deterred by certain magnets. Does the same apply with mobulids?
That's a really interesting question, and it's something that hasn't been assessed yet, to my knowledge. but there are potential alternatives at the moment that people have been looking into with the lights, so light-based bycatch reduction using LED lights. And Vidya, who used to work with us, conducted a project a couple of years ago with the Manta Watch, assessing the possibility of like using LED lights on gill nets to reduce, like to basically repel mobulid rays from nets. And I think they did have like encouraging results. Also, some collaborators of ours working in East Flores, the Missile Foundation, they also did a study looking at that. And Iqbal, the leader of that study, also found encouraging results. So this is like our kind of first line of like, I think in general, like in the community, trying to understand more about the use of LED lights to reduce the bycatch. And that's what I hope some of the data on the vision can help like to do, basically to understand which colors work best. And Manta Trust is like developing like some trials to try and do that also in other locations, like including in Peru with some people who manufacture these lights. SN Tech is one of the people doing that, doing great work. So the magnets is not, yeah, it's like let's say a next step that potentially should be looked into. I know in sharks, I think they had kind of mixed results, like depending on the species, like doing this. And another thing that I was kind of interested in is also like and again, like magnets, but also like the electromagnetic fields. So like weak electromagnetic fields also being used in some cases to try and reduce the bycatch of sharks. And again, there's some people trying to do that in Indonesia, but the thing is that that's not really adapted to gill nets. It's very difficult, or currently I don't think there's a lot of, I don't know if people have done that on gill nets specifically. And lights, whereas lights are more adapted to be able to like hang them onto the gill net. So that's a good question, and we don't know what the answer is yet. So maybe someone will be able to look into that into the future.
Yeah, sounds like there's loads of promising research going on with it, even though you can't answer it exactly yet.
Yeah, and all of this is kind of, it's also tricky when we, to conduct like these kind of trials, because you need, ideally, like you need to have some information on like these characteristics, like these senses in the animals, also like to understand what their capacities for detecting magnetic fields is, because we could have like there's always things that come into play when we're doing trials that could not be directly linked to the effect of the magnets. And when we're talking about things like mobulid rays, the Dakota's bycatch, like the amount, let's say the abundance of catches per gill net is quite low. It's the quantity of gill nets and the quantity of boats that makes the catch concerning for their survival. So if you're on one gill net boat with a couple of gill net boats, it's also very difficult like to kind of compare these numbers, because we're talking about very low catch per unit efforts per boat. But of course, it's still possible to do it, and things to look at in the future.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you, guys. I think we'll have to wrap it up there. But thank you so much for joining us and giving such an enlightening set of talks. I hope you enjoyed yourselves. Betty, where can we find your project on social media?
So there's a Facebook page called Mobula Project Indonesia. And then there's more information about also our work on the Manta Trust website on the Mobula Project Indonesia again. We also have an Instagram page that we're just starting, so there's not much on there, but if you want to follow us, we'll definitely be posting more stuff as soon as we're back in the field, hopefully by the end of this month, or I hope in the next couple of weeks.
Wow, that's soon. That's really exciting.
Yeah.
And Beth, when can you get back to Hanifaro Bay? Do you know yet?
We're talking with the rangers at the moment. So at the moment, all the marine protected areas here are still closed. We work really closely with the rangers that patrol Hanifaro Bay Marine Protected Area, and hopefully it's going to open at the end of this month. Then we need to look at getting a research boat and all of the logistics that come with it at this time, and movement between islands in the Maldives. But hopefully, yeah, we'll be able to work closely with the rangers, and we'll be out the next full moon, which is the beginning of July. So Fingers crossed.
Exciting.
They're there. I saw mantas 2 days ago, about 20, not in the bay, but at a site we call Digutilla. Very unexpected. I was just sat on top of the boat cruising. I always keep my eyes open, and we arrived to the dive site and went to jump. And as I was walking down the steps from the top of the boat, I saw one pectoral fin, and without my brain even processing, I shouted manta ray. I was so glad it was mantas, because there was a high chance it could have not been mantas. But yeah, so we got to swim with some the other day, but not in the bay.
That's so exciting. I'm just a little bit jealous.
And the first whale shark was sighted the same day. What? So there's a whale shark in Bar at the moment as well. So we just need to be lucky and yeah, get to see it.
Very exciting. Okay, I hope you both can get out in the field very soon. And yeah, thanks again for joining us, and thanks for everybody who tuned in and asked some really good questions. As always, you can find out more about the Manta Trust and all of the affiliate projects like Betty's on the Manta Trust website and Manta Trust social media pages. And you can also find out about upcoming webinars. We have one tomorrow morning. It's at 9 a.m. BST, so you better be early risers to catch this one. But it's going to be with Mark Erdeman, who is working with Conservation International, and he's going to be talking about tagging marine megafauna, so mantas, whale sharks, all kinds of marine animals, the pros and cons, and how we can use this to better research and conserve these animals. So I think this is going to be a really interesting talk, and I hope some of you can tune in. You can also support manta and mobula research and conservation. One of the ways you can do this at the moment is by donating to our emergency GoFundMe appeal. Any money raised will go towards the affiliate projects that are in need because they've lost money due to a lack of tourism or other influences during the pandemic. So we really appreciate any money that you can give, and it will go directly into mobulid conservation and research. And I think that's just about it from me. But yeah, thanks everyone for watching. Thank you, Betty. Thank you, Beth. And hope to see you guys soon, and hopefully you get back in the water soon.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Bye, guys.
Bye.